Well, hello there, and welcome to a film a day with me, Jordan Woodley, on day, I'm going to boldly say 34, although that may not be correct. It's gotten to that point now where keeping track is becoming increasingly difficult, but that's what I'm confidently going to say. And today I am looking at the 1999 Matthew Broderick film, Election. There's a lot I want to say about sort of the language of the film, and it is full of subtext and satire, but just to give a quick rundown, it follows Matthew Broderick, who is a high school teacher, who, due to machinations, essentially changes the outcome of the student election to prevent Reese Witherspoon, again another Reese Witherspoon performance, from winning her presidency. That is quite late into the film, but it's stated very early on that that's really what's going to happen, and it's more about the character building and why the characters sort of act the way they act. This is a dark comedy, and when it says dark, it is blacker than black. Because it's interesting, because this was one of those films that I was very tempted to go away and read about extensively, because I worried that before doing this video, there was a significant amount of satire relating to events that might have been politically relevant at the time, or I felt like there was a lot of subtext that was completely going over my head because I didn't have the context for it. It's very deftly written, and it really touches upon that level of sort of darkness within suburban American society that really was starting to come up at around that time. I like with films like Pleasantville or American Beauty. I really got an American Beauty vibe from this film. I saw American Beauty a few years ago, and I liked the film. I did, but I didn't think, like many who sort of now look back at the film, I'm with the consensus that it is not as solid a film as it was proclaimed at the time. It does have some really interesting visuals, but the language of it got lost a little bit. In the message got lost in trying to be too artistic. Whereas I think, really, I mean, Election wasn't overlooked at the time, it was regarded, but I almost feel like Election is a great satire of its time that people really should go back to. And I think, really, if you were to put American Beauty and Election next to each other, there are lots of reasons to somewhat allow American Beauty to go by the wayside. The Kevin Spacey of it all, of course, but, even internal narrative reasons. But I do think Election really knocks that out of the water, really. I think Matthew Broderick, you could say, was very much an embodiment of the 90s, or the 90s performer of his style. Because he, of course, came out with Ferris Bueller's Day Out, started to build himself a really strong career in the early 90s, and then just things started to topple quite hard with for instance, the thing that immediately comes to mind is the 1996 Godzilla, which he is not the problem with that film, but he is part of the problem with that film. And then you just get to, this is now starting to breach into the early noughties, but you get to a point when he's starring in things like that Christmas film, that with Danny DeVito in it, and that's the point. And I have heard, people talk about the rumours about that film, and the fact that Matthew Broderick was in a really bad way when he was filming it, to the point where he was saying, so this is rock bottom. Apparently he was purportedly heard muttering to himself. And I think it's a shame, because I think, really, as I said, he really embodied that kind of performer of the 90s. And I think this really was the peak of his... I wouldn't say the peak of his career, but the peak of that representation of him. If you sort of start with Ferris Bueller and then and get to the end with Election, you really get a sense of someone who goes from, an embodiment of people we want to be with Ferris Bueller and admire, to the embodiment of middle class white privilege / angst, which was strange, because that was very much a narrative that kept popping up around that time. Of course, with American Beauty, but then you could also, of course, refer to Fight Club, where there's this sense of, like I say, white-collar, male white men who were unhappy, but didn't know how to represent that dissatisfaction in a way that was healthy. And Election is very much about that, because it's about... the narrative is from the perspective of, or one of the voices is Matthew Broderick's, who puts a front of someone who is very contented with his life, his marriage, his job. He feels like a pillar of his community, and you just watch the whole thing collapse just so quickly. And it very much demonstrates that he is not as important as he thinks he is. And there's this brewing rage and resentment in him. And his relationship with women, because he has his wife, Linda. He has his friend's wife, who he's been helping out, because at the beginning of the film, his friend's wife is discovered to have been having an affair with the student played by Reese Witherspoon. And so she kicks him out, and Matthew Broderick ends up helping that woman, and they develop a relationship of some sort. And Matthew Broderick's relationship to Reese Witherspoon. And you really see his attitude to women and repression explored in a way that's quite interesting in sort of the 2020 look back at that time. Because again, the narrative is he is trying to tell you as a character that he's a good person, that he wants to do his best, and even when he does do something wrong, he's still trying to be a good person. But the meta text of the narrative is telling you this is not a good person. As I say, Reese Witherspoon, this is another one that quite nicely links her sort of career trajectory. After I saw Freeway a few weeks ago. Again, a very strong early performance from her, playing this very self-important, almost neurotic, overachieving character. And what I got from her is it made me think about Rachel Berry from Glee. I got a real strong vibe of that, and it really had me thinking about Glee, the show. Me and Helen, my fiance, have often talked about Glee and its very sharp decline, and what points we dropped off from it. In my case, I lasted all the way until the primary generation left for college, at which point I just didn't think the show had legs. So, there was nothing more to tell after that. Helen herself said that she watched a little of the first series, but dropped off fairly early on. And I think the reason we both came to that decision, respectively, because of course at that point in our lives, this is now over a decade ago, well, over about a decade ago, and it's interesting because what the show Glee promised in its pilot was a satirical examination of the Glee Club, and the idea, and the whilst trying to be a realistic depiction of the high school experience and the outcasts who band together to do something like a Glee Club, it was also promising a very similar biting satire that our lead, Rachel Barry, really isn't a sympathetic character as she is initially portrayed at the beginning of the pilot. She's someone who we can watch and we can sympathise with, but she is ultimately, and I apologise for the term, a theatre Nazi. And the show at that point indicated that she would be both the character we follow, but not necessarily the character we sympathise with. And that would have been a very interesting way to take the show, because it would have been like Election, where Reese Witherspoon's character, she doesn't do anything wrong, hardly at all in the film, compared to some of the other characters, practically doesn't do anything wrong. But we can tell there is something as a character that is manipulative and nasty about her. And because she is another point of view character, it means we also get a sense that where she is trying to manipulate us as the audience as a unreliable narrator, just as Matthew Broderick's character is. And as you go over the course of the film, when it gets to the point when the election is manipulated and she loses as a consequence of that, you don't necessarily feel sorry for her. And it's interesting because you don't feel bad for not feeling sorry for her, because you've seen why she is the way she is and what sort of formed her in that way. And again, as I say, she didn't do anything wrong. She just simply is a high achiever. And in that same way, it would have been nice if Glee had gone in that direction, where instead of what we got, which was much more a traditional high school drama like One Tree Hill or The OC, mixed with High School Musical, if we had something little bit nastier and a little bit more biting and more satirical and critical, that could have been a very interesting project. But that's not what it was. It probably wouldn't have hit the mainstream appeal that it did, and lasted 6 series or however long, which people would say, well, that's made it a success. What I count as success is not necessarily what, making money and having a long-running series, to me, isn't necessarily the indicator of success. To me, prestige and a long-lasting narrative that people still go back to me, is an indicator of success. But you could debate that, because it was successful, it made lots of money, it released lots of singles, it just wasn't the property that I would have wanted. Because Election is great. Election is a really funny and yet slightly haunting film where you, for 1 minute, will be laughing at sort of the awkwardness of characters and the social discomfort that's created by their environment, and in the next go, oh, actually this is an incredibly dark and socially difficult thing to deal with, that really has aged well, because it deals with things like the manipulation of power and the idea of someone in authority manipulating a young girl into a relationship of sorts. It deals with a lesbian character who is essentially rejected and ousted by her community without it being a signposted thing that it's because of her sexuality. It's more that because of her sexuality, she feels like she's on the outside and an anti-disestablishment figure, and consequently is oppressed by teachers and her parents and a friend who she was in a relationship with, but who turns on her. And really interesting things that you can go back to and are. I would definitely watch this again and try to come up with different readings of it. And as I say, do want to go away and read about it to see what subtext is lost. And there's definitely political commentary going on about more broader politics. For instance, and again, this is just to wrap up with, but just to say that the film breaks it down into Reese Witherspoon's character, who is your political sort of the person who wants to be in politics and everyone thinks is going to be, and so she just automatically is assumed going to be your political figure. A guy who is essentially pushed into it, who is popular and everyone loves and isn't a bad guy but is easily manipulated, and your anti-disestablishmentarian girl who isn't really even in it for that. She just wants to rail against it. And the fact that these three figures are your political representations definitely has a more broader political commentary to it. And I think it genuinely has layers that I didn't get the first time. So I do look forward to going into that deeper. But, like I say, it's a great film, and it's probably just what I needed. Anyway, thanks for joining me. I'll see you again tomorrow. Take care.